Hey guys, Mr. G here. In this video, we're going to take a look at graphing tangent functions with two specific kind of transformations. All right. Now we already looked at all of the transformations for sine and cosine. And with the transformations for tangents, it's going to be a little bit different. As we can see for the graph, it does look already completely different from sine and cosine. All right. So starting off with, all right, so we're going to just take a look at two kinds of transformations. When we have the number for A and a number for B. Now for a graph for tangent, there really isn't a maximum or a minimum. So because of that, there really is no amplitude for a tangent. However, if we do have a number for A, it is going to affect the Y values, all right? And then we have the period, of the tangent graph, which in this case is which is pi over b or 180 divided by b. Now the period for the original graph for tangent is 180 degrees. All right. So what that means is that if we're given a number for b, what we're going to do is we're going to take 180 degrees or pi and divide that by b. But remember, if we were to calculate the period, we would also have to calculate the quarters. So we would take whatever the period we found and divide it by 4 to figure out how do we go from one x value to the next. All right. Now, before we look at some examples, let's recall the graph for tangents. Let me see if I can zoom in a bit. All right. So we have tan of x. Now, if you guys recall in the previous video, we were able to use the unit circle to graph my tan of x. All right, so over here we have 3 different graphs, starting with negative 90 degrees and working our way to 450 degrees. So majority of the problems that we're going to do are going to be required to have 3 of the graphs. All right, so usually the period for each of the graphs, so this one would be, the period would be 180. So to go from negative 90 to positive 90, it would be in total 180 degrees. All right. And then we have the same thing from 90 to 270, the period is 180. Then from 270 to 450, the period is 180. All right. And then we have my graph, which has a particular pattern. The pattern goes low, mid, high, low, mid, high, low, mid, high. All right. So in between the two asymptotes, there is the low point, there is a midpoint, and there is a high point. And usually the low and the high points that we could easily plot have the y value for positive 1 or negative 1. Now, depending on whatever x value that we're going to get, depending on whatever number we get for A, that's going to affect the y values. All right, so let me zoom out over here. Okay, so we're going to be using the pattern for the original graph for tangent to graph my new functions for tangent. All right, so let's take a look at number 1, which we have 2 times tan of x. Let's see if I can zoom in a bit. Perfect. All right, so if we take a look, all we just have is a 2 in front of the tangent. So that means that the 2 is going to represent my value for A, which is going to affect the y values. So that means instead of having 1 and negative 1 as the highest number and the lowest number to easily plot, is now going to be positive 2 and negative 2. All right. Well, let's continue to graph the tangent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to figure out the period and the quarters, even though they're the same as the originals. So for the period, but before that, let's label my numbers for A and for B. So A, we said it was 2, and B, there's a number in front of X, so that's going to be a 1. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate the period and the quarters. All right, so we're trying to figure out the period. So we have 180. Now I'm going to be using degrees in this video as opposed to radians, just because the process of graphing for tangent is going to be a little bit different than the sine and cosine. So I have period of 180 divided by 1. I still get 180. So that means that from one asymptote to the next is going to be a total of 180 degrees. And then we have the quarters. So with the quarters, I'm going to take 180 and divide it by 4. That's going to give me, let me see. That's going to give me, let me see, 180 divided by 4. Let me actually just use a calculator. 180 divide that by 4. That gives me 45 degrees. All right, so I'm going to write it down here. So that way I can just graph it down here. All right, so we have 45 degrees as the quarters, and the period is 180 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and make my graph down here. All right. All right, so now instead of having the y values as 1, now my y values are going to be 2. So we have 1 and 2, -1 and -2. All right, so let's go ahead and figure out the x values first. And what I'm going to do before I make the graphs, I'm actually going to identify the asymptotes, even though the asymptotes for number 1 are same as the originals. All right, so I have my middle point, which is 0, 0. And then I have the two asymptotes in between 90 and -90. Right? So from -90 to +90, the period is 180. All right? And then, all right, and then if I were to separate, all right, so this is the middle, so I were to separate it into 2 halves, so we would have one number over here and one number over here. And for each x value, we're going by 45. So we have 0 to 45, and luckily we have 45 to 90, and then we have 0 to -45. All right. So now I'm going to use the characteristics, the pattern from the original graph. So this is the mid. So I have mid, low point, and then the high point. I'm going to use a red pen, and then connect the points. All right. So that's one graph. Now I'm going to make 3 graphs for a majority of these problems. So moving on from there. So I go now from 90, and then I go to another asymptote that's going to be a full 180 degrees. Now what I can do is I could take 90 and add it to my period, which is 180, and that's going to give me 270. So from 90 to 270, that's going to be a full 180 degree period. All right. And then I have a middle point in every graph in between 2 asymptotes. And then I'm going to split the middle into 2 smaller halves. All right. So now for each x value going by 45. So 90 plus 45 is 135. 135 plus 45 is 180. 180 plus 45 is 225. And then 225 plus 45 is 270. Cool. And then I'm going to use the pattern to get my graph. So we have asymptote, then low, -2. Mid, we're still at 0. And then high is at 2. All right. All right, so that's my second graph. So then for my final graph, so now I'm going from 270 to another 180 degree period. So I'm going to take 270 and add it to 180, I get 450. So from 270 to 450, that's a full 180 degree rotation. in a unit circle. All right, so from 270 to 450, I have a middle number, which would be on the mid. And then I have my two smaller halves, which is going by 45s. So if I add 270 to 45, I'm gonna get 315. Then 315 to 360. And then if I add 360 to 45, I get 405. And then from 405 to 450. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and make this graph by using the pattern. So we start off at low, -2, mid, still at 0, and high at +2. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and connect the points. All right, so luckily none of the x's changed. All that really changed was the height. But now we're gonna have a situation for number 2 where we have tangent of 2x. So if we take a look, we're gonna have a change in periods, which is gonna affect the x values. So let's go ahead and label my numbers for A and B. And my A, there is no number in front of tan, so that's gonna be 1. And for B, there's a number in front of x, which is 2, so B is 2. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and, let me move this up a bit, now I'm gonna figure out the period. So we have the period, which is 180, divide that by B, which is 2. So then I get 90. So that means that in between two asymptotes, there's gonna be a full 90-degree rotation. That means that from 1 degree to the next, which has the asymptotes, is gonna be 90 degrees in total. All right, but now I wanna figure out the quarters to see how do we go from one x value to the next. So I'm gonna take the 90 divided by 4, and that's gonna give me 22.5 degrees. So that means that for each x value, we're gonna go 22.5 degrees. So I'm gonna go ahead and make my graph. All right. So luckily the height just doesn't change. So I'm at +1, -1. All right. Then I have my midpoint over here, 0, 0, so still at 0, 0. Okay. So now we gotta figure out what are gonna be the two numbers that are gonna, so what we gotta do is we gotta figure out what are gonna be my numbers for the asymptotes since the x values change. All right, so if you recall, there's always an asymptote in the middle, two asymptotes in the middle of the 0, 0. So now what I need to figure out is what are my two numbers, all right? Okay, so and then we know that for every midpoint there is another halves. All right, so now we'll be able to figure out what are the numbers in between. So if we recall, the quarters to get from one x value to the next is 22.5. So I'm going from 0 to 22.5. And then if I were to add 22.5 to a 22.5, that's gonna give me 45 degrees, all right? So then what if I were to go in a negative direction? So it would have been 0 to -22.5. And then if I were to add this to a -22.5, since we're going in a negative direction, that's gonna give me a -45. So that means that from -45 to +45, that's gonna be a full 90-degree period. All right. So then I have the pattern of the tangent graph to make this graph. So we add 0, 0 for the midpoint. So at negative 22.5, I'm at the low, mid, then high. At positive 22.5. Then connect the points. Perfect. Another way you could have figured this out is, let's say we have a full 90-degree period. Now, we could have taken, we see that this is the middle, and what we could have done was we could have taken half of the 90 and see that this would be 45. So then if this half would be 45, then this other half would be a 45. But since this is a negative direction, we would have negative 45. There's many ways to figure out, to get started with the x values. So now I can figure out the next two asymptotes. So I'm at 45, starting at 45, and then I figure out my other asymptote. So I'm going to take 45 and add it to my period, which is 90, and I get 135 degrees. All right. Then I have my midpoint, and then the two halves in between the midpoint. All right. So remember, for each x value, we're going by 22.5. So if I do 45 plus 22.5, I get 67.5. Then if I add 67.5, I should get 90. All right. Then add 90 to 22.5, I get 112. Let me write this down here. 112.5. Okay, and then I get, if I were to add 112.5 to 22.5, I would end up with 135. So we're good. So now I'm going to use a pattern to graph my seconds. So we have low at 67.5, mid at 90, and high at 112.5. Then connect the points. I have my pattern. All right, now let's keep it going. So I'm only just gonna draw one more part. So I have 135, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take 135 and add it to the period, which is 90, and I get 225 degrees. All right. So this is 225. I have the midpoint, and then I have my other two halves over here. All right, so now we're gonna figure out what are the rest of the x values. So I'm gonna take 135 and add it to 22.5. I get 157.5. All right, and then I take that and add it to another 22.5. That's gonna give me 180. Then add 180 to 22.5. That's gonna give me 202.5. Look at these degrees. These are new. So then if we were to add this to 22.5, we should get 225. So then I'm gonna use the pattern. Starting off after the asymptote is gonna be a low point. Then we have the midpoint, and then we have a high point. Then connect the dots. And there we have it. We have number 2, which is tan of 2x. And if we were to compare, if we were to compare the original graph for tangent to the new graph, we definitely do see, let me see, how could let me pull this up. All right, so if we take a look at some of the x values, we see that they have definitely decreased. All right, so we went from 45 to 22.5, 90 to 45, 135 to 67.5. So each of the x values are being reduced by a half, or we can say divided by 2. Reduced by a half. All right, so let's move on to 2 more examples. So let's take a look at example 3. Now, example 3, we have tan of 1/2 x. All right, so what we're gonna do is, first off, we're gonna figure out what are my values for A and my values for B. All right, so there is no number in front of the tangent, so my coefficients is gonna be a 1, and for B, there's a half. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna figure out the period. So with the period, I'm gonna take 180, divide that by a half, which may make the number period bigger. So I have 180 divided by 0.5, and if I were to, or half, but I'm gonna say 0.5, that's gonna give me 360 degrees. All right, so instead of in between two asymptotes, it's going to be a 480. It's actually now going to be 360. And we're going to see that when we're graphing. And then let's figure out the quarters. So we're going to take 360, divide that by 4, and then I end up with 90 degrees. All right. So let's go ahead and make my graph for number 3. So the numbers are definitely going to be bigger. Okay, so I have my midpoints over here at 0, 0. And then I have my two asymptotes in between 0, 0. And then I have my other other halves. Okay, so now what we can do, we know that the quarter to get from one x value to the next is 90. So I'm going to go from 0 to 90, 90 to 180. Or what we can do is we can take half of 360, which we get 180. And then since this is all cut up in 4s, we already figured out the quarter. We know that each x value is going to 180. So now on the left side is going to be the negative versions. All right. So the full period, 360 period, is going to be from negative 180 to positive 180. My y value stays the same. So starting at negative 90, that's going to be my low point. Low, mid, high, 90, 1. All right, now moving on to the next graph. So we have 180 to my next asymptote, which is going to be a large number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 180 and add it to 360, and that's going to be 540. So I have my midpoint, I have my low, my two halves. So I go from 180, then add it to 90, I get 270. Then 270 to 360, then 360 to, let me see. So 360 plus 90, we get 450. All right. So now following the pattern, after this asymptote, we start back at the low, then at the mid, then at the high. Connect the points. All right, now one more piece. So I'm going to take 540, add it to 360, I get 900. So we see that the numbers are increasing by a lot from the original graph for tangent. Then we have the midpoint, then we have the two halves. All right, so I go from 540 to 630, add it to 90, 630, add it to 90, 720, 720, add it to 90, I get 810, and then add it to 90, that should get you 900. And then we have the pattern for tangent. We start off at low, then mid, then high. All right, so this is my graph for number 3. And if we compare that graph to the original graph, we see that majority of the x values, we see that the x values doubled by 2. All right, it definitely increased by a lot. All right, so let's take a look at one more example, which we do have a change in 2 of both the period and the y values. So if we were to label my A, My A is gonna be a half. My B is gonna be 3. All right, so now what we can do is we can figure out the period. I take 180 divided by 3, that should get me 60 degrees. All right, and then to figure out the quarters, I take 60 divided by 4, and I should get 15. Let me double check. 15, perfect. So to get from one x value to the next, we go by 15. All right, so the numbers are definitely gonna be much smaller along with the y value. All right, so we have 0.5, 1, negative 0.5, negative 1. So the y values are definitely gonna shrink by a half. All right, and then the x values, let's take a look. Let's figure out the first two numbers for the asymptotes. All right, now we have the midpoint on the x-axis, 0, 0, and then we have the 2 halves in between the midpoint for the low and high. And we know that for the quarter, to go from one x value to the next, we're going by 15. So we have 0 to 15, and then 15 to 30. So then now we would have the same numbers, but in the negative version. So we would have negative 15, then negative 30. All right. So now I can go ahead and use a pattern for tangent. So we start off at 0, 0. Well, that's the middle. We don't start off here. We actually start off on the asymptote, and then we go to the low point, which is negative 15, 1. That's the mid. Then the high, which is 15, 1. Connect the points. Perfect. Then we have one asymptote to the next. I take 30, add it to another 60, I get 90. So a full 60-degree period is from 30 to 90. I had my midpoint, and then my 2 halves. All right, so we go from 30 to 45. Yes. Then 45 to 60, 60 to 75, and then 75 to 90. All right, and then I use the pattern for the second part of the graph. So I'm at the middle. Originally this was 180 and now it's 60. Then I go to the low point. Oh, I think I did something wrong. It shouldn't be by 1, it should be by half. So the y values are definitely decreasing. So it should be like this, right here, right over here. Some of you guys may have spotted that right away when I was graphing. That's perfect if you did. So now let's correct that. So for 45, we're at the lowest, which is a negative half. And then at 75, we're at positive half. So I'm going to connect the points. Now remember, with the asymptotes, the graphs are never touching them. So we have the second graph. So now we're going to move on to 90 to the next asymptote, which is going to have a full 60-degree period. So if I take 90 and add it to 60, I should get 150. I'm on the money. So I have 150. I have the midpoint, and then 2 halves. All right. So then I go from 90 to 105, 105 to 120, 120 to 135, then 135 to 150. Let's go ahead and finish this off. So we start off, so originally we had 360 as a midpoint, but now we're at 120. All right, so then we go, after 90, we start off with the low point. So we start off at 105, negative half, then mid, 120, 0, and then 135, positive halves. Connect the points. Perfect. So if we take a look, we do see definitely a decrease in the x values and a decrease on the y value, since instead of being at 1, we're now at half. Even though originally I started at 1, but most of you guys already corrected that when I started. All right, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. Hope you guys have a wonderful day.